It started on a fog-heavy morning in the summer of 1980, the kind of morning where the air itself seemed unsure if it wanted to move, and every sound felt muted, swallowed by the damp silence. The village of St. Bartholomew was still half asleep, a scattering of stone cottages along a single winding road, tucked deep in the green folds of the countryside. Here, time moved slowly, news traveled slower, and for as long as anyone could remember, the small convent on the hill had been its quiet heart. Inside its walls lived four women sisters: Agnes, Margaret, Lucia, and Claire. They weren't just nuns to the village, they were neighbors, healers, and sometimes, in the private crises no one dared speak about, they were the keepers of secrets. Each had her own story, her own reason for choosing a life of prayer and seclusion, but together they shared a rhythm: waking before dawn, tending the gardens, feeding the hungry, and offering a kind of unspoken comfort that only came from people who listened more than they spoke. That morning the mist was so thick you could barely see the bell tower from the path. No one thought much of it. Fog like that could linger until noon, but by mid-afternoon, when the bell for evening prayers still hadn't rung, a ripple of unease began to pass through the village. It wasn't like them to be late, not once in all the years anyone could remember. By nightfall the convent stood silent. The heavy oak door was shut, but not locked. Inside, candles still burned, tea still steamed in cups on the long wooden table, and 4 sets of rosary beads lay neatly beside open prayer books, but the women, all 4 of them, were gone. No one saw them leave. No one heard the door open. The dogs in the village hadn't barked. There were no carriage tracks, no footprints leading away in the damp earth, no notes, no signs of struggle. It was as if the morning fog had simply taken them. Word spread slowly at first, whispered from one doorstep to another, until the local priest, Father Michael, was called to the convent. He was a gentle man in his 50s, with a soft voice and a way of making people believe him when he said things would be all right. But when he stepped inside and saw the untouched tea, the half-written letters, and the faint smell of incense still hanging in the air, his face changed. From that moment, St. Bartholomew was never the same. The police came first from the nearby town, then from the city 2 hours away. They searched the convent, the gardens, the woods. They dragged the river. They questioned the villagers, though no one had anything to give them. The story made the local papers, then disappeared just as quickly. After a few months, the case was closed. Officially, there was no evidence of foul play. Unofficially, everyone knew something strange had happened, something they couldn't explain. Years passed, the convent doors stayed shut. Father Michael kept the key, visiting now and then to dust the pews and keep the garden from growing wild. The village learned to stop asking. Outsiders occasionally passed through, curious about the nuns who vanished, but there was little to tell. Eventually, the memory of that morning became just another shadow in the village's long history. But history, as it often does, has a way of circling back. It was 28 years later when Father Michael, older now, slower, his hair gone completely white, unlocked the convent door again. He'd gone there on a winter afternoon to collect some old parish records, but something in the air stopped him. The dust was thicker now, the candles long since burned to stubs. But there was something else, a faint, unfamiliar smell, like damp stone and something sweet, almost metallic. And then, in the far corner of the chapel, he saw it, a door he had never noticed before. Father Michael stood very still, his breath caught somewhere between his chest and his throat. He had walked this chapel hundreds of times over the years. Every pew, every crack in the flagstone floor, every flicker of the morning light through the stained glass was familiar to him. Yet somehow, this door had never been there before, or maybe it had, hidden behind shadows, waiting for someone to notice. It was narrow, barely wider than his shoulders, with wood darker than the rest of the paneling. The grain looked old, almost blackened with age, and a thin seam of dust traced its edges. There was no handle, just a small, round indentation, as if something once fit there but had been removed. He reached out, his fingers brushing the surface. The wood was cold, not the kind of cold you'd expect from an unheated chapel in winter. This felt different, deeper, as though the chill came from somewhere far beyond the wall. For a long moment, he just stood there, his hand resting against it, listening. Nothing, not the groan of wood, not the whisper of wind through cracks, only silence, thick and unmoving. He stepped back, shaking his head as if to clear it. He'd been in this place too long, he thought. Maybe his mind was playing tricks on him. He turned toward the altar, intending to gather the records he'd come for, but something tugged at him, a quiet insistence in his chest, the same feeling you get when you've forgotten something important and can't remember what it is. He left the chapel with the papers in hand, but all the way back to the rectory, the image of that door stayed in his mind. That night, he barely slept. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the 4 nuns as they had been the last time he saw them standing together at the convent gate, the morning before they disappeared. Sister Agnes, the eldest, with her silver hair tucked neatly under her veil and eyes that always seemed to see more than they let on. Sister Margaret, tall and quietly strong, with a laugh that warmed even the coldest days. Sister Lucia, the youngest, with a restless energy that sometimes made the other sisters sigh, though they loved her for it, and Sister Clare, gentle, soft, spoken Clare, whose hands always smelled faintly of lavender from the garden she tended. He remembered the way they waved to him that morning, nothing unusual, no sign of worry, and yet, less than 24 hours later, they were gone. The years that followed had eroded much of the village's urgency about the case. People married, children grew up, and life carried on. But for Father Michael, the absence had never settled into something he could accept. He had prayed for answers, though they never came, or at least not until now. The next day, after morning mass, he returned to the convent. The air was still and heavy, dust motes drifting like faint stars in the winter light. He crossed the chapel without hesitation and stood before the door again. The indentation where a handle should be caught the light in a peculiar way. He pressed his thumb into it, but nothing happened. He tried pushing, pulling, even knocking softly, but the wood did not move. Frustration prickled at him. This was absurd, a grown man letting himself be drawn into a game with a door. And yet, some quiet part of him insisted that the answer to a question he'd been carrying for nearly 3 decades was behind it. He didn't tell anyone about what he had found, not yet. He didn't want to invite the kind of talk that would spread through the village like smoke. Instead, he began visiting the convent more frequently, always under the guise of organizing old records or tending the gardens. And each time he found himself lingering near that door. Weeks passed, the winter deepened. On the coldest nights, when the wind rattled the rectory windows, he would dream of the nuns' dreams so vivid they left him unsettled for hours after waking. In one, he stood in the chapel with them, but their faces were turned away, their hands folded in prayer before the closed door. In another, he walked the convent corridors, calling their names, only to find the hall stretched impossibly long, the shadows swallowing his voice. It was during one of these sleepless nights that he began to think back to the weeks before the disappearance. At the time, he had dismissed certain things as nothing unusual: a locked garden gate that should have been open, the faint smell of smoke drifting from the hill even though no fire burned, the way the sisters sometimes paused in their work as if listening to something distant. And there was the letter. He had almost forgotten it until now, a short, carefully written note from Sister Agnes, sent to him only 2 days before they vanished. It wasn't unusual for her to write, but this one had been different. It spoke of a matter she wished to discuss in person, in quiet, and away from ears not meant to hear. She had signed it simply, with trust in his wisdom. He had gone to see her the next day, but she was busy with visitors and asked if they could speak the following morning. That morning never came. Now, sitting in the dim light of his study, he realized that note might be the last direct link to whatever truth lay behind their disappearance. The following afternoon, he searched the parish archives for it. He found it tucked between pages of an old account ledger, the ink slightly faded but still legible. He read it again and again, each time feeling the weight of what had been left unsaid. When he returned to the convent the next morning, he brought the letter with him. Standing before the door, he held it up, almost as if it might serve as a key. He knew how foolish that was, but he could not shake the thought that Sister Agnes had meant for him to find something, perhaps even this door. As he stood there, the sunlight shifted, catching the dust in the air and throwing a faint beam across the indentation where the handle had once been. In the center of the beam, he saw it not a smooth curve of wood, as he had thought, but a shape, carved so finely it was almost invisible. A cross so small it could fit on the tip of his finger. His heart pounded. Somehow he knew this was not just decoration. Father Michael traced the tiny cross with the edge of his thumb. The grooves were shallow, worn smooth by time, yet the shape felt deliberate, intentional, as if it had been placed there for someone to notice, but only when the light hit it just right. He leaned in closer, letting his eyes adjust to the shadows. Around the cross were faint marks, almost like scratches, but not random. They curved in patterns, circles within circles, too precise to be the work of accident or age. He stepped back, his mind turning over possibilities. Why would there be such a marking on a door hidden in a chapel no one had entered in decades, and more importantly, had the nuns known it was there? He thought again of Sister Agnes's letter, her insistence on speaking privately. The phrasing had been cautious, almost coded, in quiet and away from ears not meant to hear. It was not the way she normally wrote to him. In the weeks that followed, Father Michael began speaking more with the few villagers who had been around in 1980. Most of them were older now, some too frail to remember clearly, but every conversation added small pieces to a puzzle he didn't fully understand. Mrs. Delorier, who lived near the base of the convent hill, remembered seeing a stranger walking up the road the day before the disappearance. She said the man carried no bag, wore a heavy coat despite the warm weather, and never came back down. Old René, the former gravedigger, claimed he had heard chanting late that same night not the familiar hymns of the sisters, but something in a language he couldn't place. He had been drinking, he admitted, but the memory still made his hands tremble. Others told quieter stories, the flickering lights in the convent's top windows after midnight, the strange way the air felt heavier in the gardens that summer. A sound, like low humming, that seemed to rise from the ground itself. Some villagers dismissed these tales as the result of fear and imagination, but Father Michael had learned long ago that truth often hid in the smallest, most easily ignored details. And then there was Etienne. He was only a boy when the nuns vanished, but his family had lived near the edge of the woods behind the convent. Now a man in his 40s, he spoke carefully as though weighing each word. He remembered waking one night to see his father standing at the window, staring toward the hill. When Etienne asked what he saw, his father only said, "Go back to bed," but his voice had been strange, tight, almost fearful. It wasn't until years later, after his father's death, that Etienne's mother told him the truth. His father had seen lights moving in the convent garden, not lanterns, not candles, lights that hovered above the ground and glowed with a pale, unnatural white. Father Michael kept these stories to himself. He didn't want to stir the village into speculation, but the more he heard, the more he was certain that the nuns' disappearance was not the result of some simple misfortune. Something had been building in those days before they vanished, something that had left its mark not only in memory, but on that hidden door. The priest's visits to the convent became almost daily. He would walk the quiet halls, listening for sounds he knew would not come, pausing at each room as though the walls might whisper something back. In the sisters' quarters, everything was still in place, the beds neatly made, the small wooden crosses above the headboards, the drawers with folded clothing that had not been touched in nearly 30 years. Dust lay thick over it all, but it was the kind of stillness that felt more like holding its breath than decay. One afternoon, while searching through the convent's storage room, he came across a wooden chest he didn't remember seeing before. The lock was old, the metal dull and flaking, but it gave way easily with a gentle twist of his keyring. Inside were stacks of journals, each bound in brown leather. The handwriting varied, some neat and measured, others rushed and slanted. These were the sisters' own records. He took the top one, its pages fragile and yellowed, and began to read. The first entries were ordinary notes about the garden, letters from other parishes, mentions of visiting priests and charity work. But as he moved forward through the pages, the tone began to change. Margaret wrote of unsettling visitors, a people who came asking strange questions about the convent's history, pressing for details on old traditions long abandoned. Agnes noted that on certain nights, the chapel felt colder than it should, even in the height of summer. Lucia described waking to hear footsteps in the hall, only to find no one there. Claire's final entries were shorter, almost hurried, ending with one line, "It is near now." Father Michael read those words again and again. Near to what? The more he studied the journals, the more he noticed certain references repeated in all four of their writings, mentions of the lower hall, the unfinished room, and the place we must not open. None of the convent's floor plans he had ever seen listed such a place. He began to wonder if the hidden door in the chapel led there, but there was another problem. A faint unease had begun to creep over him each time he entered the building now. It wasn't anything he could point to directly, no sounds, no movement, no obvious change in the air, and yet the silence felt different, as though something in the convent had become aware of him. Sometimes, when he turned away from the door, he had the strangest feeling that if he looked back quickly enough, he might see it open just a fraction, only to close again before he could blink. The tension gnawed at him, but he couldn't stop. One evening, long after sunset, Father Michael lingered in the chapel with a lantern. He placed it on the floor so the light fell directly on the cross carved into the door. As the flickering glow played across the surface, the surrounding scratches seemed to shift. He leaned closer, realizing they formed a pattern, concentric rings, broken at intervals by tiny marks. They looked almost like a map, but a map to what? The next day, he returned to the village library to search the oldest parish records, hoping to find some mention of the chapel's construction. Most of the documents were unremarkable, but one brittle ledger caught his attention. It was dated 1836, long before the nuns of his time had lived there. In the margin of one page, in faded ink, someone had written, "Do not disturb the door beneath the altar. It was sealed for a reason." Father Michael sat back, his heart thudding. This meant the door was older than he had ever imagined, older than the convent itself, perhaps, but sealed. For what reason? The more he learned, the more questions surfaced. And somewhere in the tangle of unanswered mysteries, he began to suspect that the nuns had not simply vanished, they had gone somewhere, or been taken, and that door might be the only way to follow. The days that followed were a blur for Father Michael. He felt as if he were living in two worlds, the ordinary rhythm of the parish, and the shadowed, silent pull of the convent on the hill. Every free moment was spent inside those stone walls, studying the journals, tracing the carvings on the door, trying to piece together a truth that seemed to slip away just when he thought he had it in hand. Sleep became rare. When it came, it was restless. He would dream of the nuns again, but now they were closer, their faces partly turned toward him, their lips moving as if whispering his name. In these dreams, the chapel was always lit by a strange, pale light that didn't seem to come from the candles or the windows, and always, the door stood open behind them, though he could never see what was beyond it. During the day, the village itself began to feel different. The people still greeted him kindly, still smiled when they passed, but he could sense the undercurrent in their voices. They noticed his distraction. They saw the tired lines under his eyes. A few of the older villagers gave him looks that lingered too long, as though they suspected what had begun to consume his thoughts. One evening, Etienne came to the rectory unannounced. He stood in the doorway, hat in hand, glancing over his shoulder before stepping inside. "I've been thinking," he said quietly, "about what my father saw that night, the lights in the garden." He paused, searching for the right words. "He told my mother later, they weren't just floating, they were moving together, like they were following something or someone." Father Michael felt a cold knot tighten in his chest. "Someone," Etienne nodded. He thought it might have been the sisters. The idea lodged itself in the priest's mind and would not let go. The lights weren't a random occurrence, they were connected to the nuns, to their final night. And perhaps to what lay behind that door. The next week was marked by a growing sense of urgency. The air in the chapel seemed heavier, almost charged. The dust hung thicker, the shadows stretched longer. Sometimes, when Father Michael stood by the altar, he could swear he felt the faintest vibration under the floor, like the hum of a distant bell. Then, one late afternoon, as the winter sun dipped low and the light streamed in through the stained glass in a deep amber glow, something shifted. The beam caught the carved cross perfectly, and for the briefest second, the wood around it seemed to shimmer. His breath caught. He reached out, pressing his palm firmly against the indentation. This time, there was a sound, a faint click, deep within the wall. He froze, heart hammering, listening. The sound faded, replaced by silence so complete it was almost a weight on his ears. The door did not open, but he knew something inside it had changed. That night, he couldn't bring himself to leave the convent. He lit a single lantern and stayed in the chapel, sitting in the front pew, watching the door as if it might decide on its own to move. Every creak of the old building made him tense. The wind outside rattled the shutters, and somewhere in the distance, a fox cried out in the dark. Just past midnight, he heard the sound of footsteps, not loud but steady, measured. They came from somewhere deep in the building, a place where no one had walked in decades. He rose, lantern in hand, and listened. The steps drew nearer, then stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. "Who's there?" His voice echoed softly through the chapel. No answer, and then, without warning, the lantern flickered and went out. The darkness closed around him, thick and absolute. For a moment he thought he heard voices low, layered, speaking in a tone he could not understand. He turned toward the sound, and though his eyes struggled to adjust, he could just make out the outline of the door. It was open, not much, only an inch, maybe less, but enough to show a line of black beyond it, darker than any shadow in the chapel. He stepped forward slowly, his hand trembling as it reached for the edge. A cold rush of air spilled through the gap, carrying with it a scent that made his stomach tighten. Damp stone, earth, and something faintly sweet, like the smell of flowers long dead. He leaned closer, straining to see into the space beyond. That was when he felt it, not a touch, exactly, but a pressure, the undeniable sensation of being watched from the other side. Every instinct told him to step back, to leave, to lock the door, and never return. But the pull was stronger now than it had ever been. He knew, with a certainty that made his skin crawl, that whatever lay beyond that door was the key to what happened to the 4 nuns all those years ago. And if he walked away now, he might never know. He took another step forward. The hinges creaked softly, the door opening just a fraction wider. The darkness seemed to breathe, and somewhere deep within it, something moved. The movement beyond the door was subtle, but Father Michael felt it as much as he saw it. A shifting of the dark, like a shadow pulling itself back just far enough to keep from being seen. His pulse thundered in his ears, his breath catching in his throat. He gripped the lantern, forgetting it had gone out, and stepped closer still, the cold air spilling over him in slow, steady waves. Then came the sound, faint, almost swallowed by the stillness, the slow scrape of something against stone. It didn't sound like footsteps now. It was heavier, dragging, deliberate. His instincts screamed at him to close the door, to run, but there was something about that sound that rooted him to the spot. In the darkness beyond, a whisper rose. It wasn't words at first, just a breathy murmur that curled around him like smoke. Then, faintly, almost too soft to hear, a voice spoke his name, not Father Michael, but Michael, the way only close friends or family might say it. He stumbled back a half step, that voice. It was familiar. It took him a moment to place it, but when he did, his stomach dropped. It was Sister Agnes. The sound came again, clearer this time, but still muffled by the weight of whatever space lay beyond the door. "Michael, help us." A shiver raced down his spine. For 28 years, those women had been gone, presumed dead, their absence a wound the village had quietly learned to live with. And yet here was her voice, not aged, not strained exactly as he remembered it. He leaned forward, peering into the black, trying to find her, but the moment he did, the voice shifted. It was no longer pleading, it was urgent, insistent. "Don't let them through, them." The word rang in his head, sparking a dozen questions at once. Who were they? What were they? Before he could speak, the darkness seemed to ripple, and from deep within it came another voice. This one was nothing like Sister Agnes's, low, steady, and oddly measured, like someone reciting a line they had practiced for years. "It's too late, Michael. The seal is breaking." The door, still only barely open, trembled under a force he couldn't see. The cold grew sharper, biting at his skin, and the air seemed to thicken, pressing in on him from all sides. His mind flashed back to the journals, to the warnings written in hurried hands, to Claire's final entry. "It is near now." The lantern in his hand sputtered to life without him touching it, casting a thin circle of light just inside the door. For the first time, he could see the outline of the space beyond a narrow stone passage leading downwards, its walls slick and glistening as if with moisture. And in the half-light, just for a heartbeat, he saw movement at the bottom of the steps. Not one figure, several. They were still, facing upward as though waiting. The sudden sound of footsteps in the chapel behind him made him spin around. Etienne stood in the doorway, his eyes wide and pale in the weak light. "Father, I saw the light from the hill. I thought—" He stopped mid-sentence as his gaze shifted to the open door. "What is that?" Father Michael swallowed, his voice low. "I think it's where they went." Etienne took a step forward, but the moment his foot touched the chapel floor, the voices returned, a chorus this time, layered and discordant, rising from the dark beyond the door. The sound wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made the air vibrate. And then, almost imperceptibly, the door creaked open another inch. The figures at the bottom of the steps began to move. Father Michael felt the pressure in his chest tighten. He knew, with a clarity that cut through every doubt, that crossing that threshold would change everything for him, for Etienne, for the village, and perhaps for far more than that. But he also knew that closing it might not be an option anymore. Because whatever was behind that door was no longer waiting for an invitation. It was coming up. The figures on the steps moved slowly, their shapes becoming clearer as they climbed toward the faint lantern light. Father Michael's breath quickened, and beside him Etienne's grip tightened on the doorframe. At first the movement seemed unnatural, their forms bending at strange angles, but as they reached the edge of the light, the truth cut through him like ice. It was them, Sister Agnes in front, her silver hair tucked neatly under her veil, her face exactly as it had been 28 years ago. Behind her came Margaret, then Lucia, and Claire, all of them unchanged, their eyes fixed on him with a strange mix of relief and urgency. Time had not touched them, not a single line, not a hint of age. "Michael," Agnes said, her voice calm but strained, "you shouldn't be here." The air between them felt thick, charged with something more than the cold. Etienne stepped forward, his voice breaking the silence. "You've been gone for decades, Everyone thought, "They can't hear this." Agnes interrupted sharply, glancing toward the darkness behind her. The faint sound of footsteps echoed up the passage, too many to count. Her gaze snapped back to Michael. We stayed to hold it, to keep it from coming through. He understood then. The seal, the warnings in the journals, they hadn't been taken. They had chosen to stay beyond the door, guarding whatever waited in the depths. "The seal is failing," Margaret said, her voice low. "Something has changed. Someone has been trying to open it from your side." Michael's stomach dropped, his own visits, the light catching the cross. The click he'd heard. "I think I already yes," Agnes said, reading the truth on his face. "You weakened it." The footsteps below grew louder, and with them came a sound like breathing, slow, deep, and wrong. Agnes stepped forward, placing her hand against the inside of the doorframe. "If you close it now, it will hold, but if you don't," she didn't finish. She didn't need to. Michael looked at Etienne, whose face was pale with fear. "Close it," Etienne whispered. "Whatever this is, close it." But before Michael could move, a voice rose from the darkness below, deep and resonant, shaking the stones. "You cannot keep me here forever." The air in the passage swirled, and a shadow began to rise, taller than the figures before it, its edges shifting like smoke. Michael felt his knees weaken, but Agnes reached out and grabbed his wrist. "Now," she hissed. He shoved the door with all his strength. It moved slowly, resisting as though something pressed back from the other side. The cold surged over him in a final wave, and for an instant he thought it would not close. Then Agnes placed her palm flat against the wood, and the door slammed shut with a force that shook the chapel. The cold vanished, the silence that followed was total. When Michael looked at the door again, it was as it had been before, no seam, no shadow, no opening. Just a wall of dark wood with a faint carved cross at its center. Etienne let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Was that real? Michael didn't answer. He stepped forward, running his fingers over the cross. It felt warm now, almost pulsing. For a moment he thought it was over, the danger contained, the seal restored. But then as he turned to leave, something caught his eye, a small slip of paper wedged between the pew and the wall. He pulled it free and saw the writing, neat, careful, and unmistakably Sister Agnes's hand. It read only one line: "This was never the only door." A chill that had nothing to do with the winter air ran through him. He looked back at the sealed panel, then to Etienne, who was staring at him with wide, questioning eyes. Somewhere in the depths of the convent, faint and distant, came the sound of another hinge creaking open. The seal might have held here, but somewhere else something had just stepped through. Father Michael froze, the scrap of paper trembling slightly in his hand. The words were simple, but their meaning opened 100 possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. This was never the only door. He turned it over, but there was nothing on the back, only the faint scent of lavender, the same as Sister Claire's garden so many years ago. Etienne shifted beside him, his voice low. "What does that mean?" Michael didn't answer right away. He could still hear it, that faint creak, somewhere deep in the convent, far from the chapel. It wasn't loud, but it was the kind of sound that made the air still, the kind that made your body instinctively listen. They stood there for several seconds that stretched long, the silence pressing in. Finally, he slipped the note into his coat pocket. "It means," he said quietly, "that we're not finished." Etienne glanced toward the dark hallway beyond the chapel. "You're not going to go looking for it tonight, are you?" Michael shook his head. "Not tonight." His voice carried a weight that wasn't just fear, it was knowing. He understood now that closing one door might have been nothing more than a temporary victory. But whatever had been behind it wasn't alone. He could feel it. They left the chapel together, the cold night air sharp against their faces. The path down the hill was lit by the pale glow of the moon, the village lights flickering faintly below. In the distance, the church bell tower stood against the dark sky, steady and unchanged, as if nothing had happened. But Michael knew better. Something had happened. something that would ripple far beyond the walls of the convent. Back at the rectory, he sat in his study with the lamp burning low. Etienne had gone home, reluctant but unwilling to linger any longer. Michael took out the sisters' journals again, placing them carefully on the desk. The leather was worn, the pages fragile, but the words inside now felt sharper, more urgent. He reread the entries about the place we must not open, and the unfinished room, but this time he was looking for something different, hints of other locations, other sealed spaces. He found them in passing mentions, often hidden between mundane notes. Sister Margaret wrote about a locked storeroom under the kitchen that no one used. Sister Lucia described an oddly warm section of the cellar wall. Claire's journal mentioned a door in the east wing that had been bricked over before her time, and Agnes had written only, "They are not all in one place." It was enough to convince him that she had known from the beginning. The door he had found was not the only barrier. Perhaps there had been more. Perhaps they had been spread throughout the convent, or even beyond it, and if one had been weakened, it was possible the others had been as well. The next morning, Michael returned to the convent alone. The winter sun was weak, casting long shadows through the broken clouds. The building was silent, but the silence felt different, now heavier, as though something in its walls was holding its breath. He moved carefully, his footsteps echoing in the empty halls. He started in the kitchen, finding the narrow stair that led down to the storeroom below. The door was old, its wood warped, but it opened with a slow groan. The air inside was damp and stale. Crates and barrels lined the walls, untouched for decades. He searched every corner, tapping on the walls, listening for a hollow sound. In the far corner, he found it a section of stone that rang faintly when he knocked. Running his fingers along the edges, he found faint carvings almost worn away, and there at the center a tiny cross. He didn't touch it. Not this time. Instead, he stepped back, a slow exhale leaving his lungs. This was proof enough. There was another door. Over the next week, he found two more. One in the cellar, just as Lucia had described, the wall warmer to the touch than it should have been in winter. Another in the east wing, behind the bricks, the outline faint, but they're all the same. Each one carried the same cross, the same subtle markings as the chapel door. He didn't try to open them, not yet. He understood now that closing the first had required the nuns' help, and he had no way of knowing if they could help again or if they were even still there, on the other side, holding back whatever waited. The village never learned the full truth. Michael told them only that he had found traces of the sisters in the convent, that they had been protecting something. He spoke carefully, leaving out the details that would have sounded too strange, too frightening. Most accepted it without question. Some, especially the older ones, seemed to understand more than they admitted. Etienne kept his silence too. He returned to his work, but there was a new wariness in his eyes when he passed the convent hill. The two men spoke often, though rarely, about what they had seen. It was the kind of shared knowledge that needed no repetition. Winter turned slowly toward spring. The days grew longer, and the village life returned to its familiar rhythm. Michael continued his duties, but there was always an awareness, a constant hum in the back of his mind. The convent remained locked, the keys in his keeping. He visited regularly, checking each of the hidden doors, noting the feel of the air, the quiet of the halls. And sometimes, late at night, he thought he could hear it faint, distant, the sound of someone walking behind those walls, not hurried, not threatening, just there, waiting. It was in early summer that the final peace came to him, though he couldn't explain how. Perhaps it was a dream, perhaps something else. He saw Agnes, standing in the convent garden under the full moon. She didn't speak at first, only looked at him with the same calm, steady gaze she'd had the morning before she disappeared. Then she said, "We can't hold it forever. When the last door opens, you'll have to decide." He woke with the words echoing in his head. He didn't know what she meant, not fully, but he knew the decision would come. And when it did, it would not be his alone to bear. The summer passed without incident. The doors remained closed, but Michael kept the journals close, reading and rereading them. committing every detail to memory. The note from Agnes stayed in his pocket, the paper softening with wear. Years later, when he was much older, people would ask why he had never reopened the convent, why it had remained locked even as the village changed around it. He would always give the same answer, because not every door should be opened. He never spoke of the night in the chapel or of the shadow on the stairs. He never said how many other doors he had found or how often he had wondered whether they were still holding. But on certain evenings, when the wind shifted and the air grew colder than it should, he would pause, listening for that faint creak of a hinge in the dark. And each time he heard it or thought he did, he would look toward the hill, the convent standing silent against the fading light, and whisper a quiet prayer, not for himself, but for the ones still standing guard beyond the doors. Some mysteries, he had learned, were not meant to be solved. They were meant to be kept, and somewhere in the stillness, beyond stone and shadow, 4 voices would sometimes answer, soft as the turning of a page, "We are here."